Hi, everyone. Welcome to Chapter 1, the main themes of microbiology. This is Part 1, the scope of microbiology. I'm Dr. Berlin, and let's get started. So in this chapter, we will learn about the different types of microorganisms that we'll be talking about in the semester and what you'll be working with in the laboratory. Now, in the laboratory, you will mostly be working with bacteria, but we'll learn about other microorganisms as well. And we'll identify different professions that use microbiology. So, what is the scope of microbiology? Microbiology is the specialized area of biology. And of course, biology means study of life. Microbiology means the study of life that's really small, things that are generally too small to see with the naked eye. Now, as we will learn, there are some things that we study in microbiology that are pretty big, like mushrooms, for example, or tapeworms and things like that. So we do have some organisms that are quite large that still fall under microbiology. Yeah, I guess that's just kind of how that works out. We refer to them as microorganisms or microbes. Sometimes people will call them bugs or germs. There's all kinds of other names that you might hear to refer to different types of microorganisms, like viruses or agents. A lot of times, agents will sometimes be another term that people will use for viruses, and a lot of microbiologists just call them bugs. I guess that's like, calling them pet names almost. And there are thousands upon thousands upon thousands of different types of microorganisms all around us. They're everywhere. They're on our bodies. They're on our uh, countertops. They're in the air. They're in the soil. They're in the water. They're in our cars. They're pretty much everywhere we are. And most of them don't have anything to do with us. They're just living in their little microenvironments, whatever that might be, and going about their lives without anything to do with us. Only a small number of microorganisms cause disease in humans and are harmful to humans. And those are the ones, of course, that we tend to be the most interested in. And those are the ones that we're going to talk about most in our course. But you should be aware that there's a lot of things that don't cause problems for us. So, what are the major groups of microorganisms? Well, we have the cellular microorganisms, those that possess a cell, and we tend to distinguish the two different cell types as prokaryotic or eukaryotic. Now, your textbook has introduced the term akaryotic um, as well. So, we have arrow here. Prokaryotic is the traditional term that we use for that. And then I want you to make the distinction. Sorry, prokaryote, and your textbook talks about eukaryote. We'll talk oops, not the Y, R O T E. And then the rest of these guys, including helmets, are eukaryotes. So your book will talk about this, but I also wanted to talk about it for you, is this distinction, the classical distinction between the two different cell types of bacteria and archaea being prokaryotic and fungi, protozoa, helminths being eukaryotic, as well as humans, we're eukaryotic. The distinction being EU means um, new, karyo means nucleus. So eukaryotic cells have a nucleus, and prokaryotic cells are before. Pro means before a nucleus. A means without. So eukaryote is also correct. It means without a nucleus because bacteria and archaea don't have a membrane-bound nucleus. Now, this word eukaryote can also be used to describe things like your mature red blood cells because they also lack a nucleus. But they are not a prokaryotic cell. They're not bacterial or archaeal. Other things are eukaryotic, like viruses. In some texts, they refer to eukaryotes as viruses. Um, so I just want to make that distinction, and I'm sorry if that's making it more confusing. If you have any questions about it, please feel free to email me or let me know. Okay. So the other thing, so those are the cellular microorganisms, and then we have the non-cellular. And sometimes you'll see that written instead of non-cellular as acellular with the A in front of the word cellular. And again, when you see that letter A in front of a word like that, all as one word, it means without. Okay, so without a cell. And that's going to be things like viruses and prions. They're going to fall into that category. So microbes are both easy to study and hard to study. They're easy to study because they grow pretty fast. You'll find in the laboratory that you put something on an agar plate. It doesn't look like you put anything there, and then you come back. You came back the next day, which is when the plates get pulled out of the incubator and put into the refrigerator to wait for you to come back. But if you looked at them the next day, there'd be lots and lots and lots of bacteria there. So it doesn't take long for bacteria to grow generally, but they're difficult to study because they're really small and it's hard to look at just one, and it's hard to distinguish them sometimes when they're in a population. There's just a whole lot of things that can make them a challenge to study. They reproduce rapidly and they can be grown in the laboratory, but they can't just be seen by glancing at them. Like you can't just look at a petri dish and see the microorganisms. You have to dig a little deeper. So what do microbiologists do? They study cell structures and functions. They look at growth and physiology. They study genetics. They try to design hierarchies and taxonomies, figure out where they fit into the phylogenetic tree. And they try to look for interactions of microorganisms with the living and non-living environment. And so not all microbiologists do all of these things. People will study one particular aspect of things. And a lot of these things will also then come into play with human health and trying to develop medications and treatments and things like that for those organisms that are involved in human disease. So the different branches of microbiology include medical microbiology. These are people who work in the clinical laboratories in the hospital. They might work at the Centers for Disease Control and Public Health and do that sort of thing. Um, these are people who are looking at diseases in humans and animals. And most of what we will talk about in our class is related to medical biology because generally the majority of students are pre-nursing or pre-healthcare, pre-dental hygiene, things like that that relate to human things. But you can also study how infectious diseases are transmitted and spread across communities, and we've seen a lot of epidemiology as we've lived through the COVID pandemic. We've seen epidemiology in action, looking at those weekly statistics. How many people got sick this week? How many people died this week? How many people were hospitalized this week? Where are these diseases spreading and things like that? So that's the kind of thing that uh, public health and epidemiology does. You can also do immunology. In fact, that's actually my field. I'm trained as an immunologist. I used to do research into cancer and trying to develop ways to boost the individual patient's immune system to fight their cancer. So we were taking an immunological approach to fighting cancer and developing what we call tumor vaccines. But those were self each of those would be unique to that individual patient for that treatment. Because immunology, again, it's a whole field. We'll talk a little bit about immunology at the end of the semester. We don't have anywhere near enough time for that topic. But this is looking at how does the body respond to the infectious disease? What's happening? What is inflammation? What what does it how does our body fight um, infectious diseases? What are the mechanisms of that, and how can we boost that up? We'll talk about vaccinations, things like allergies and that sort of thing all fall into the area of immunology. There's also industrial immunology. These are people who work at the water treatment plants or make sure that our food and water is safe and there's not too high of levels of microorganisms in our food and our drink. And then biotechnology, again, that's another huge area where people use microorganisms to produce all kinds of products from beer and wine to various drugs and various enzymes that we need, chemicals, all kinds of things that can be produced by microorganisms. We have agricultural microbiology where people are looking to see how can the microorganisms in the soil enhance the growth of certain plants, or harm the growth of plants, and how can that be controlled and regulated to keep the plants and animals healthy that are being used for human purposes. And then also environmental microbiology, looking at microorganisms in various places around the world, whether it's down in a deep sea vent in the bottom of the ocean, or in the Antarctic, or near a volcano, or in your backyard, wherever you might want to look. And that can include even areas called like astrobiology, where people are looking for what might life look like on another planet, and what would that take? So that brings us to kind of the end of this section. And by now, you should be able to answer these questions. What types of organisms are considered microbes? And you remember that whole long list that we have? We have bacteria, archaea, um, fungi, protozoas, and helminths. And then you should be able to list and describe at least three branches of microbiology, like immunology, um, astrobiology, medical microbiology, various fields like that. So you can go back and look at those and answer. That's the end for section 1, and check back for the next section. Thank you.